Welcome and thank you for joining us. We're super excited for week 8 of our 2020 Why We Ride series. My name is Beth Haley and I'm a 2009 and 2018 Bike and Build alum and currently a doctoral student at the Boston University School of Public Health. If you're unfamiliar with Bike and Build, you can usually find us each summer as we run cross-country and regional cycling trips for young adults that benefit affordable housing and empower young adults to become civically engaged. While we unfortunately can't run our trips this summer due to the pandemic, we're excited to continue our mission through a few different programs, including the speaker series. Our chosen cause is a complex one. Affordable housing is more than just a home. It's an issue deeply entwined with education, racial inequity, public health, government lending, transportation, fair wages, zoning laws, and so much more. Through this series, we hope to dive into the nuances of the cause, hearing from a diverse range of speakers, all working towards a common goal: fair, decent housing for all. And tonight, we're really excited to hear from Ethan Mascoop about the intersection of housing and health. So Ethan is an adjunct clinical instructor of environmental health at the Boston University School of Public Health. Ethan was a former health department director and currently works as an independent consultant for large institutions and boards of health in Massachusetts. Ethan received his Master of Urban Affairs and a Master of Public Health degree from Boston University, so he's a double terrier, where he first helped me connect the dots between housing and health during one of my first classes in 2018. Ethan has a 30-minute presentation prepared, and we encourage you to use the Q&A box throughout the talk. We'll ask those questions and have a discussion at the end of the presentation, and I'd like to hand it over now to Ethan. Take it away.
Thank you, Beth, and good afternoon or good evening to everyone on the Zoom webinar. First of all, Beth, thank you very much for inviting me, and Eric as well, and everyone there. It's a pleasure to be here this evening and also to support the work that you do. Beth, I listened to your introduction. I just want to add to, you said your interest is in fair and decent housing, as I jotted down your comments, and I want to add fair, decent, and safe and habitable housing as well. So I want to broaden out that discussion a little bit in terms of my talk this evening. And by the way, I do agree very much that it's a very complex subject. Just my part alone, my area of interest could take a full semester's class. So we're going to try to condense this into a very short, brief period of time. So if you allow me, I'll choose what I think is most important or most of interest, and I apologize if I leave something out. But I do encourage everyone to ask questions, and we'll try to leave a significant amount or adequate amount of time at the end of the presentation for some discussion. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So this is just the title. All right, we'll just move on to the next slide. Okay. All right, I'd like to do a poll before we get started with my talk, and that is, I'd like to know from everyone here, if you're willing to share, and this is anonymous, by the way, I will not know names. What is your current place of residence? Is it safe and habitable? The answers could either be yes, no, or don't know. Okay. And there's no right or wrong answer. Okay. All right, so that's about it. All right, so approximately 82% of the folks listening say that yes, your place of residence is safe and habitable, and one person, 9%, says no, and the other one doesn't know at all. All right, let's move on with the next slide. This is good to know, and I'll ask the same question at the very end of the presentation if you feel the same about your apartment or where you live after we go through our talk. All right, please move on to the next slide. Okay. I don't see the next slide yet. If you could move the polling results for me, or do I remove that?
I think they've been.
I got it. Good. Okay. Thank you. All righty. So I live in Boston, and I work in Massachusetts and Rhode Island for the most part. And I wanted to share with you partially some of my work here in the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, but a lot of this also is relevant across the country. What's very common here in the Northeast, in Massachusetts, and in Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Maine, are the triple deckers. Also, as you can see there, this was, the reason I show this photo of a triple decker is I know that your topic over the summer is affordable housing. And this was a version, a very common, typical architecture for affordable housing back at the turn of the century, of early 1900s. As you can see there, you can see the brown building, or in the buildings alongside of it as well. Usually these are affordable, relatively speaking, at the time. The owner would probably live on the first floor, and the top two floors would be extended family coming in, new immigrants, and they were generally related, and they would help raise the entire, the building would help, the people living in the building would raise the children and support each other, and it would form a community. These buildings still exist today. They're quite common, but they're no longer, for the most part, working in that kind of system or that kind of paradigm. And this is also now part of the, in a more, in the gentrified areas, as well as areas in the city where we find a lot of substandard housing. To the right, there's a rooming house. This is an illegal rooming house in the city of Brockton, not far from Boston, about 20 miles south. And an illegal rooming house. These are, again, affordable housing, market rate. They're not subsidized. They're not paid for by Section 8 or HUD housing. And this is also very typical. We'll talk about it a little bit more. Next slide, please. Great. So I want to point out, I gave a little bit of homework ahead of time for those of you that registered for the talk. If you didn't do the homework, that's fine. But I wanted to point out early conditions. These are photos. There's a couple of photos here. This is one photo from Jacob Riis. Last name is R-I-I-S. Jacob Riis was a young man when he came to this country in the mid-1800s, and born in Denmark. And he was a photographer. He was a photojournalist, essentially, when he settled in New York City. And he was part of that social reform movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he documented conditions of the tenements in Lower East Side in Manhattan. And I wanted to point out this one particular photograph, where if you can see how many people are photographed here, or in the picture, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 on the first level, and on the upper bunk, there's at least 2 individuals. So that's at least 6 people living in this one-room basement apartment or basement tenement. You can see to the left, there's a stove, and you can see on top of the stove or the heater, there's some bundles and some pots and pans. These are the kinds of conditions that Jacob Riis photographed over about 10, 15 years in the Lower East Side, and publicized the conditions of the tenements, particularly in the Lower East Side. Lower East Side at the time was one of the most densely populated areas in the world, and it was a center where immigrants came in. I also want to point out here in this photograph, Jacob Riis writes that as he attempted to do photography, as he did his photography, it wasn't as easy as it is today, obviously, but I just want to give a short description how he described taking photographs. And, you know, these are dark places. He would take a frying pan, put gunpowder in the frying pan, then shoot the gunpowder with a pistol. That would ignite the gunpowder, light up the area, so then he could take his photograph. As he writes, this was fraught with danger. Sometimes he would burn, buildings would burn, people would be injured, but that was how he took his photographs, particularly obviously in dark areas. The reason this photograph is also important, later on in the discussion, I'd like to talk a little bit about what is overcrowding and what are some minimum standards. As I said earlier, in the history of housing codes, before Jacob Riis's time, before the social reform movement, there were beginnings of, or the start of housing codes in the United States, and it was really based upon what we call the miasma theory of disease. And that is, the belief was, or the common belief, or the accepted belief was, that disease was born in night air. It came from bad smells and bad odors, from rotting foods and produce, from sewage. All these smells that came into the air were causes of illness, particularly things such as tuberculosis and cholera. Right now we're suffering through a pandemic. Pandemics were common in the 1800s. approximately every 30 years, there'd be a pandemic or an epidemic that would wipe through Western civilization, or actually the world. And sometimes they'd be focused more, let's say yellow fever, various epidemics of yellow fever would occur, let's say in New York City or Philadelphia or elsewhere. So it's very common. So the idea is to help control disease was to change these conditions so there'd be some enough light, enough air coming into the rooms. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is another common, this was a view of a rooming house in the Lower East Side. This was in the basement of a police station. The individuals sleeping there paid 7 cents a night for the privilege of using this as a boarding house or a rooming house. And by the way, in all these pictures, most of them, quite often the outhouse, there was no running water and the plumbing was outdoors, and there would be, the code required one outhouse for every 40 individuals. Next slide, please. This came from one of the links I gave you to look at. There's a collection of the Jacob Riis photographs that's held by the Museum of the City of New York, and there's about 7,000 photographs that are digitized and online. This is one of them. Under the code, the earlier codes in New York City, they required air for ventilation, and they required air shafts. So the tenement owners were able to sort of design these very narrow and narrow air shafts, and that would satisfy the requirements of the code. Here you can see a bathtub was shoved out of perhaps the roof of a building or one of the windows, and the air shaft is so narrow that the bathtub got stuck in between the two buildings. But that satisfied the codes in the early part of the century. As I mentioned before, one last thing about the early housing codes. The first codes were for the miasma theory to counter or to try to eliminate disease. The second wave of codes around Jacob Riis's time during social reformation or reform was designed more or less to really try to better society. And the thought was, or the belief was, that living in the tenements and living in these substandard conditions or slums gave bad character, and it did not help people to assimilate to become Americans. So part of the goal of these codes at the time was to create or to better yourself, to better people by better living conditions. So for example, there's a wonderful description at the Tenement Museum in New York City where some of these photographs also come from. And I highly recommend going to the Tenement Museum when it's open again, hopefully soon in New York. There's a wonderful description, for example, how they prohibited young children attending public school in New York City and Lower East Side from bringing pickles in for their lunch, because the smells and the garlic from pickles certainly contributed to bad character, and it didn't help promote learning. So there was an effort to bring in better standards, so to speak, from their perspective. Next slide, please. Next poll. You have received a notice to quit, okay? And it says that you are required to leave in 14 days from your apartment. What do you do? We're now looking at modern times. Okay. All right, most of you, well, they're still voting a little bit. Okay, again, you're renting, you're living in an apartment building, and you receive this notice to quit. It's an official notice from the court, or from the landlord rather, and it says you need to leave in 14 days. What do you do? All right, so 25% said leave in 14 days. 33% said wait until the landlord takes you to court, and 42% do not know what to do. Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Next slide, please. All right. Before we read this slide, I want to share something with you. A copy of the code in Massachusetts from 1933. And by the way, I want to mention as well that housing codes, back then, back in previous decades and previous times, as well as currently, most codes, most housing codes are state by state, or even within the state, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, maybe county by county or municipality by municipality, but mostly state by state. The reason for that is that public health codes have always been seen as local, and housing codes eventually became public health codes. This is a discussion that you're hearing all the time, I'm sure, if you're reading the news or reading the newspapers or listening to the news, where why don't we establish or enforce a nationwide mask order, or responding to the pandemic. And currently what you see is a patchwork of responses, some of them intentional, some of them not, but that's the way in the United States the public health system works, and that is by local jurisdiction. So I want to share with you a part of the 1933 housing code in Massachusetts, which is relatively similar to other codes at that time and throughout the country. And in the introduction of the 1933 code, it says here, from the experiences of this office, it is evident that the lack of knowledge in the regard to the ordinary requirements imposed by law upon those who live in the rented property frequently cause bitter personal disputes. While the health and welfare of responsible tenants occupying property for dwelling purposes receive special consideration, it must be borne in mind that one of the chief foundations of our government is the protection of property ownership. Okay, that was in 1933. And it goes on. I just want to read a tiny bit more, a short period more. When you entered into a lease for an apartment in 1933 in Massachusetts, and again, this was relatively common across the country, you should, as a tenant, before you sign that lease, according to the code, you should negotiate clauses such as who pays for taxes and assessments on the property, who pays for utilities, who pays for insurance and what kinds of insurance, who is responsible to make repairs, who is responsible for injuries to third parties, who is responsible for shoveling snow off the roof, which was a second means of egress, and it goes on. And finally it says, the general rule is that the tenant, whether for years or at will, in the absence of express agreement, takes the premises in the condition in which he finds them. It always says he. And then it goes on, if the tenant enters into possession of the premises and finds that they are in need of repair, the landlord is under no obligation to repair them unless he has expressly agreed to do so. And the tenant is not excused from paying rent by the defective condition of the premises. In fact, the law holds that the tenant must pay rent even though the premises were totally destroyed. And this is important. The code or the law in the 1930s said that it was based upon early English common law and agrarian practices. The landlord owned land, and the landlord would then rent the tenant the land, and the tenant came in and would build some sort of a structure. It could be a lean-to, a tent, or a small hut, and would then plant, grow, and harvest crops on the property, the land. And then when the time was up, at the end of the lease, the tenant would then return the land back to the landlord. And both parties did what they were supposed to do. The landlord provided the land, and the tenant did whatever the tenant was going to do on that land, but returned the land in the same condition he or she found it, or actually he, because a woman could not be a tenant on her own under the early laws. And by the way, in court, if you are, to say that you have standing in court means that you can argue, you can claim something, you can bring a case in court. But the reason that it's called standing was back in the day under English common law, only people who owned property to stand on had standing in court. So again, in Massachusetts, for example, it said, even if the property were to be destroyed, the tenant still had to pay the terms of the lease because they were leasing the land, not the building. All right, so now moving up to, so what happened in that time to now? And I'm showing you a code, a statute in Massachusetts, but I'll talk about that in a moment. What happened between the 1930s and now, or pretty much the 1970s? There was a concept, or there was a standard called the implied warranty of habitability. And what that basically means is this. The courts faced with these kinds of issues and complaints and eviction cases through the 1930s and 40s and 50s and onward, the tenants were complaining about various substandard conditions, whatever they may be: roofs, foundations, wiring, plumbing, sewage, what have you, or bad water. And the courts eventually recognized, under the warranty of habitability, that the landlord warrants that these conditions meet minimum standards of habitation. In other words, the courts opined that, let's say you're a tenant living in a large multi-unit building, maybe there's 30 units in your building, you, the individual tenant, it's not possible for you, the tenant, to be responsible and deal with the infrastructure of the building, such as the roof, the plumbing, the wiring, the foundation. And that now became the responsibility of the landlord. And this time now the landlord also owns the building, and you, the tenant, occupy it as a renter or as a tenant. In Massachusetts, housing courts were created in the 1970s. Here's part of the enabling statute, which is the jurisdiction of the housing court is directly or indirectly deals with the health, safety, or welfare of any occupant of any place used or intended to use as a place of human habitation, the possession and condition or use of any particular housing accommodation or household goods or services. Very, very broad. Now, next slide, please. Now, the housing code, again, I'm using Massachusetts as an example, but again, you can go to your own jurisdiction. Here, the purpose of the code, this is CMR, Code of Massachusetts Regulations, are to protect the health and safety and well-being of the occupants and of the housing and general public, to facilitate the use of legal remedies available to occupants of substandard housing, to assist boards of health in their enforcement of this code, and to provide a method of notifying interested parties of violations of conditions which require immediate attention. This is a far cry from the 1930s, in which the government's main interest was the protect property ownership, or the people that own property, as well as responsible tenants, and the fact that the two parties would come to some sort of an agreement as to who's responsible for the upkeep and the maintenance and the habitability of these buildings. All right, next slide, please. Third poll. Okay. You're living in an apartment, and I have a severe rodent and cockroach infestation in my apartment, and the landlord has not responded to my complaints. What can I do? Okay. All right. Most of you are saying call the local health department or inspectional services. One is saying call local legal services, and one does not know. All right. Excellent. Next slide, please. All right. Well, those of you that said call legal services, most states, all states actually, I think except for one, has legal services programs. This is designed, again, created out of the Great Society programs, the War on Poverty from the 1960s under the Lyndon Johnson administration, where various programs were created, and that's when the warranty of habitability also came to be. Legal services were created for civil cases. By the way, an eviction is a civil case, it's not a criminal case. In the United States, the Constitution guarantees legal representation if you're charged or accused of a criminal case, such as murder or drunk driving or what have you. Evictions or summary process, those are civil cases. Here in Massachusetts, we have a relatively robust legal services program. As you can see bolded here, the latest study in Massachusetts, civil legal aid programs turn away approximately 64% of all eligible cases. So if you're being evicted, or if you have bad conditions and the landlord's not responding, and the health department doesn't provide the service necessary, or if you're afraid to go to the health department, you're afraid to exercise your rights, and you try to go to legal services, you might not even have that security or that protection, with all due respect, because legal services has limited fundings and they are short on resources. But that is right now our current safety net for legal remedies or legal support for tenants when no other source is available to them for support. Next slide, please. So I'd like to do very briefly, and then we'll open up for a discussion. I'd like to go through some of the conditions that Massachusetts, and again, this is relatively common in many states. By the way, when I say many states, the one state in which there's no warranty of habitability, it's never been codified, that is in the state of Arkansas. And that would be a discussion that's a good 2-3 hours long in of itself. But in Massachusetts, for example, these are the conditions that are deemed to endanger or impair health or safety of an occupant. So these are conditions that rise to a level that the code says tenants must have, the landlords must provide to the tenants. And these are public health codes. Unlike building codes where they're grandfathered in, you will go out and you're building a building under, as you do your biking programs. Well, you're building the buildings based upon building code requirements. These public health requirements are somewhat different. Sometimes they overlap, but they're also different. In other words, for building codes, you build into the code as it was established at that time of the building. Public health codes are retroactive. They do not allow for grandfathering except for certain conditions. All right, next slide, please. So, for example, you need to have a supply of water that is sufficient in quantity, pressure, and temperature. So, for example, in this slide here is a photograph of a building where there's a filter in the basement. Tenants moved in, and there was no pressure in the water. Went into the basement, and we found that the water filter was so clogged that the water couldn't even go through the filter and into the rest of the system. And the filter was actually creating increased the contamination of the water than actually protect it. So in other words, the water system needs to be safe. Here you see a sink, which can be operated by a screwdriver. That is not allowed, or that's a condition that's deemed to be of high urgency. Next slide, please. Failure to provide heat. Is the heating system safe? What is the temperature? Now in Massachusetts, it's a requirement to have heat during the winter time. From winter here in Massachusetts by code is defined September 15th to June 15th. Well, if you're in Florida, obviously it's very different. But there's no requirement in Massachusetts for air conditioning. And that may be of concern or of an issue as we enter into more global climate change. And these issues or these conditions will need to be looked at probably more urgently than not in terms of providing safe and habitable housing for occupants even in the northern part of the country. These photographs of the heating systems here are all various deficient heating systems that were leaking carbon monoxide into the apartments and were inefficient. But heat is important. Next slide, please. Failure to restore electricity, gas, or water. That also is the landlord's responsibility. In other words, they must provide in Massachusetts the meters, the infrastructure, and the landlord is forbidden to remove those fixtures or to even turn off the utilities, even if the tenant is not paying rent. I'm talking about Massachusetts here. The landlord cannot take away basic fundamental human needs, such as water, gas, electricity. Those would be immediately by court turned back on if a tenant were to go to court for a restraining order against the landlord, again, regardless of paying a rent or not. Next slide, please. Electrical facilities also. What about electrical facilities in common areas, outdoors? Again, that's a landlord's responsibility, and it needs to be constantly, and it cannot be paid for by the tenant. These are common area fixtures, and if the tenant does not have exclusive control, then the landlord must provide and pay for these fixtures. I have a slide here showing a photo showing a light fixture on a pull string. And again, in Massachusetts, that's a violation of code. Imagine you're in a dark hallway, a common hallway, you're on the 3rd floor, and you're looking for the pulse, the pull wire, or the cord to turn on the light. And instead of finding the cord, you trip, fall down the stairways, go over the railings, and become injured or even die from the injuries because, again, the lights were not operable in accordance to code. Next slide. Safe supply of water. This is in the city of Brockton. It's a highly urban area, a very urban area, and we found a well in the backyard, and behind that fence was an auto supply shop. And the auto supply shop, or auto repair shop rather, not supply but repair shop, was leaking contaminants into the well. So the requirement for potable water is a fundamental requirement, fundamental need by code. What is potable though? And again, it depends on your jurisdiction. In Massachusetts, as in all states, yes, there are guidances, there's requirements for federal guidance if you're providing a public water supply system. But if you're supplying, or if you're providing for less than a certain level of service, let's say 25 or fewer connections or individuals, then it becomes a private system or a semi-private or semi-public system, depending on what jurisdiction you're in and what they call it. But those are controlled, those are regulated by local government. And in some governments, some localities, there are no regulations whatsoever. Some localities, they have very robust and very comprehensive regulations. What are they complying with those regulations? Are those regulations actually adequate for providing safe and potable water? Next slide, please. Failure to provide a toilet and maintain a sewerage system. Again, if your sewerage system is leaking, if it's outflowing, or if it's leaking onto the surface, again, that would be cause for that's a violation. And this, by the way, I want to point this out partially because Beth is with us and she works as a graduate student at the School of Public Health, or I think a doctorate student. So this toilet, for example, is loose. And we've done a study, a colleague of mine has done a study and published a study in which we've seen VOCs, or volatile organic compounds, using preferential pathways along plumbing lines from, let's say, a Superfund site or a contaminated site. And those VOCs, or those volatile organic compounds, which are hazardous, they can be carcinogenic, depending on what they are, can enter into the breathing space of an apartment. So just the fact that it's a loose toilet could be very hazardous. Next slide, please. Egresses. You need to have safe and operable egresses. So here you have, an egress that is blocked by duct tape, or all the trash and clutter at the bottom of the fire escape. We could spend an hour on fire escapes, which I won't do, but just to whet your appetite. If you have a question about fire escapes, please ask. I'm happy to talk about them. But they need to be safe in an operable condition as means of egress. Next slide, please. Security requirements. Well, in most jurisdictions across the country, every bedroom must have at least one window that can be used as an emergency escape if you're on the 4th floor or lower. In that photo on the right, those are grates that are bolted into the wall of a bedroom window. So from inside that bedroom, the occupant cannot get out because those grates are bolted, and emergency responders like a fire department cannot enter easily without destroying the grates and removing them for emergency access. That's a violation, even though those grates were installed for the occupant's safety because the neighborhood was deemed to be dangerous. The other slide I wanted to show you, that's what's called a double key lock. There's a requirement for a key inside and a key outside. That's a violation because the inside, to open up a door, if it's locked, should not require the use of any special equipment or knowledge. It just should be use of one hand with one movement. And what happens if the door is locked and the key is dropped or is missing and you need to leave in an emergency? That time is critical, particularly if there's a fire or some other emergency. Next slide, please. Trash and clutter. Very quickly, you can see from the photos on the right, though, you can see feral cats that are congregating and breeding and harboring in the open dumpster. Cats carry various kinds of diseases as well and other hazards. Next slide, please. Lead paint. Here you can see a little girl mouthing the lead paint on the windowsill. This was a case I was involved in where the landlord was already cited for lead paint hazards and had not yet corrected those hazards. And this girl was lead paint poisoned. To the right, you can see this typical kind of what we call crocodile scaling. If you see that kind of paint, typically that would be lead paint. Lead paint in most jurisdictions is a violation if a child's under the age of 6 because of the development, the neuropsychological development of a child is impacted severely by lead paint. By the way, from a public health perspective, there's no such thing as a safe level of lead. All lead is hazardous or dangerous to humans. Okay, next slide, please.
Ethan, I'm sorry, let me just jump in really fast. Let's do like a 5-minute warning, just so we have about 12 minutes for questions. We've got some good ones in the Q&A.
Wonderful. All right, I'll move a little more quickly. Foundation problems, chimneys collapsing, bricks collapsing inwards, causing carbon dioxide hazards. Look at the to the right. There's a leaking water pipe onto a conduit or electrical wires. Water and electricity do not go well together. They could become a fire or shock hazard. Next slide, please. Again, plumbing and proper installation. These are CO causing carbon monoxide hazards. Next slide, please. Electrical. You can see on the right, there's a woman who's standing on the railing on the 3rd floor of a triple decker, turning on and off the light. That is a danger. The other photograph is from Chinatown in Boston, where the electrical wiring is essentially out of control. Next slide, please. More wiring and wiring going through walls, which is not appropriate. They could become frayed. They become fire hazards. Next slide, please. Again, wiring, because there was insufficient wiring in the apartment, they installed various extension cords. Extension cords through walls and through ceilings is a very serious violation, also a hazard. Next slide, please. Asbestos. To the left, this is friable asbestos. This asbestos is not intact. It can become airborne. And this is in a common hallway in an apartment building in Boston. Asbestos is a known carcinogen. And again, a violation of the code. Next slide, please. Smoke detectors and carbon monoxide alarms requirement. They should not be secured or blocked by duct tape. Or you can see an alarm station here which shows trouble. This was time-stamped, and during the inspection, the trouble sign went on approximately 18 months prior to the inspection. So for 18 months, that building did not have proper or adequate fire protection fire alarm systems. Next slide, please. Adequate sinks and sizes for kitchens. A wooden shelf above a gas stove. Or on the right, there's an apartment for 3 occupants, and that's the size of the counter. That is not considered safe or habitable for the occupants. Next slide, please. Mold conditions and the and lack of ventilation. You can see here, this is obviously moldy conditions. This is in an illegal basement apartment. Next slide, please. Plumbing. This is on the left. This is a gas line that was secured by aluminum foil. That's why we're getting gas leaks into the apartment, because a shutoff valve wasn't working properly. On the right, there's a rag that's shoved into a waste pipe. We removed the rag, and thousands upon thousands of cockroaches came streaming out of the pipe because that's where they were harboring or breeding. Next slide, please. Roofs, safe handrails and railings for every stairway and porch. On the one side, the roof, there's no railings. The only protection there are potted plants. A severe hazard. You can see on the right, this is on the 3rd floor, or the 2nd floor rather, of a triple decker, and there's no railings on that landing. Again, an obvious hazard. Landlords are responsible for maintaining and providing. Next slide, please. Eliminate infestation. Next slide as well on this. Next slide, I'm sorry, next one. Great. So again, these, to treat for an infestation, one must follow the labels. One must hire a registered or a licensed or a certified pest control operator. These self-help types of remedies, and these are products that the landlord gave to the tenants to try to control the infestation, and that's dangerous, that's hazardous, because we're handling various chemicals and most likely handling them improperly and in an unsafe manner to children, to pets, to themselves. All right, next slide, please. Bed bugs, common concern. Bed bugs are not necessarily, they don't spread disease, but they can be, individuals can become very allergic to bed bugs, and they can cause great distress, I would think most of you would agree, obviously. Next slide, please. And in Massachusetts, what's interesting here too is if, let's say there are minor conditions, let's say relatively minor torn screens, and the landlord has been cited to repair the torn screens, and if the violations have existed for more than 30 days after the landlord is notified, in Massachusetts, those conditions are now rise to the level of serious conditions that can impair and endanger the well-being and the safety of the occupants. Next slide. Glass pole. You have been notified by the health department that you must self-quarantine for 14 days to exposure to a COVID-19 positive individual. You happen to live in a 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment with 2 other roommates. What do you do? We're now during the time of the pandemic. Okay, most of you, 86% said, do your best to maintain social distance from your roommates. 14%, 2 of you said that ask the landlord to provide you with a safe place to quarantine. Well, the virus is going to do its best to contaminate, to spread to you. Next slide, please. And the reason I mention this because we're currently going through a pandemic. What are the minimum square footage requirements in most jurisdictions? Well, in Massachusetts, you have to have 150 square feet for the first person and 100 square feet for every person thereafter in 1 bed and 1 bathroom. I would suggest that that does not meet the requirement for maintaining at least a 6-foot separation between individuals, and also sharing the same bathroom is also quite, would be quite concerning in terms of exposure hazards. In addition, the landlord is not required in most jurisdictions, as I'm aware of, to provide you for a safe place for quarantining. That is not the landlord's job. The landlord is to meet the minimum requirements. When these minimum requirements were written, we were not concerned about social distancing and those related hazards from a virus. The reason I point this out is that the recent studies that are coming out from among the recent studies is looking at, well, it's not just socioeconomic risks, but it's also overcrowding risks for individuals, particularly those that are living in more than 1 person per room, and people have no other option. So they become, we're seeing, particularly up here in the Northeast during the early part of the pandemic, an increased level of cases. Again, perhaps one of the causes is the fact that no ability whatsoever to socially distance, even if they want to, and even if it was required. So those are some of the challenges that we're facing today. I believe one more slide. We'll skip this one. And so they require natural light. We'll skip it. And finally, I'd just like to leave you with a poem from Langston Hughes, who was a very well-known African-American poet from 1940. Okay, I think most of you had a chance to read that. I rushed through the presentation, but I hope it was helpful. I'd love to hear some questions.
All right, thank you so much, Ethan. So we've got a good handful. We'll just see what we can get through. So I think in priority here, let's say you're renting and all of a sudden you see this presentation, you realize something's not habitable. What do you do? And especially with thinking about legal services that turn away 64%, and just asking your landlord probably won't get results.
Okay, it depends what you mean by not habitable. Let's say there's no legal services, or they turn you away even with the best of intentions. It depends what the conditions are. Let's say it's an infestation, or let's say the windows are falling and not working, or the roof has collapsed because of a bad, not the roof, but the ceiling has collapsed because of bad and leaking roofs. Those conditions, yes, you should notify the landlord. If the landlord does not respond adequately, then you can call the local inspectional services, and they should come in and document it, and then issue a legal order to the landlord to repair and correct. And if the agency does not do that, or does it inefficiently or inadequately, you may be able to go to court and do an affirmative action case. Very difficult to do, or particularly if you don't have legal representation. However, it gets more complicated. Let's say it's so uninhabitable. For example, let's say you're living in an apartment where there's only one means of egress, and the code requires 2 egresses. It may mean that that apartment would be condemnable. And if it's condemnable, depending on the enlightenment of the health department, they might come in and simply condemn, and you would become homeless if you don't have a safety net. Because in most jurisdictions, there's no money provided, there's no requirement for the landlord to provide you alternate housing. And there's a risk there. So there are many tenants, in fact, that are living in very substandard conditions that are hesitant to call inspectional services or a health department because they might be afraid of being sent out to the street and becoming homeless. My experience has been that most people will put up with very, very bad conditions until it becomes unbearable, or they're being evicted, and then they try to claim conditions because they're no longer able to maintain some sort of civil relationship with the landlord. Also, in our world today, in our country today, where it's hard, it's dangerous to be an undocumented individual, an immigrant. Also, many undocumented individuals are fearful of exercising their rights. Now, in Massachusetts, as well as many jurisdictions, they have these rights to complain, to ask for habitable conditions, but the fear is overwhelming and understandable. Okay, next question. Hopefully that answered that question.
Oh, that was great. So how often are local codes changed, and do some codes stay on the books a long time? And is there any way to quickly gauge how many codes are out of date or need to be updated?
Oh my word, that's a loaded question. Very briefly, even with COVID-19, they're out of date, as I mentioned, in terms of overcrowding. How do you respond to that? Well, it's a little difficult to respond in real time because these are significant. There's stakeholders. Obviously, they range from the landlords to the tenants to the inspectors to the courts. A lot of people have an interest in these housing codes. In Massachusetts, to give you an example, the housing code that's currently used was written in the 1970s. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts decided that it was time to update the code, and I would agree that there's much in the code that needs to be updated. For example, what's potable water? To give you one example, because we know much more about water than we knew 20, 30 years ago. And we know more about contaminants and hazards. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts began the process of reviewing the code and writing new amendments in the year 1999. I was part of that then, and I'm still part of it as far as the year 2020, and we're still in the process of rewriting the code. And that has to do with the stakeholders, the lack of data, for a number of reasons. It becomes very, very difficult because most people, everyone, unless you're homeless, lives in a place, and there's a number of people who have a valid interest, and as well as I would suggest some people are trying to stop the new codes for various reasons. We can again spend a lot of time talking about it, but it varies. However, with codes and knowing when they were written, that should say on the code in most states and most jurisdictions will say it was promulgated, it was or enacted on a certain date, and when the amendments were written and all that. That's a common legal process that's required for codes. Next question.
Okay, so in reference to the Mass General Law, Chapter 185C, What's the tension between states and city governments with housing laws, especially states with big city centers and also larger rural areas?
Ah, okay. Well, in Massachusetts, there's not that kind of tension, but there is elsewhere in the country. In Massachusetts, it's a minimum code, so local communities can add to that code. They cannot detract from that code. So in other words, let's say it's potable water, use that as an example. A local community could say, well, we have a problem with radon or something in the water. We will now address that and add that to the code. But they can't reduce from the minimum standards. However, in other places in the country, the codes differ from county to county or from municipality to municipality in a more substantial way. However, though, in other parts of the country as well, like in Arizona, the courts are also handled by county, and so therefore the courts should be more attuned to those regulations that are in their jurisdiction. Not everywhere, not every state has a housing court. So for example, Rhode Island does not have a housing court. You would go to district court and you would go to superior court or whatever to have your concerns addressed. It depends on your jurisdiction. And the reason I point this out too is that, again, there's a vast inequity across the country in terms of access to codes, to standards, to legal jurisdiction. Most states do provide it, but again, it varies widely from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. However, I would want to say as well, federal standards do exist, not on the legal, well, they do exist in terms of standards. If you are living in a Section 8 or federally funded environment, apartment, then the landlord and the management company has to maintain those standards to the federal level. But the vast majority of occupants live on market rate or non-federally subsidized housing. Next question.
In a few of your examples, you said we found, and in that scenario, who is we and why, and how are you involved in these examples that you shared?
I am we, with my students from Boston University School of Public Health and other interested people. What that means is that part of my work, I don't know if, I don't recall, Beth, if you mentioned this or not in the introduction, but part of my work, and a lot of my work, has to do with consulting with legal services programs and other legal aid programs in Massachusetts and now in Rhode Island. In which we go out, we identify and record and conditions, substandard conditions, and those conditions quite often are used by tenants as counterclaims against the landlords to protect them from being evicted from their apartments. That also is a 5-hour discussion, but in Massachusetts, as well as other jurisdictions, but there's other qualifications. As I said before, in Massachusetts, even if the tenant's not paying rent, they could file counterclaims. In other jurisdictions, those of you that read Evicted by Matt Desmond, because I know that's not required, suggested for the summer reading club or group. As you'll see in the examples in Milwaukee and Wisconsin, if they're not paying rent, they're very much more limited in terms of filing counterclaims. Also, by the way, to go back to one of the earlier polls, if you decide you don't want to leave, let's say the landlord sends you an order to quit, a notice to quit. If you decide not to leave, in all jurisdictions, they still have to take it to court. There's no longer allowed in very few jurisdictions that I'm aware of, that's allowed what's called self-help. In other words, a landlord helping him or herself to your apartment. You have to go to court. Now, the issue here is what can the courts do for you? And again, that's we, in terms of going out and doing inspections. Now, since Beth is back in Massachusetts, she might even attend once the pandemic is over with, hopefully someday soon. We'll be out in the field and Beth will have something to report on if she joins us on those inspections. Okay, next question.
All right, let's call this the last one and then we'll wrap up. Is there any idea, number or stats on housing in America that isn't up to code? And who is held accountable for those that are not, assuming that this is a high number?
Oh my word. I do not have national figures. I do not. And part of it is very difficult you can estimate. I would estimate, this is anecdotally, if I look at Massachusetts as an example, I would say very rare to find an apartment that meets all the codes, all the requirements. That's almost unheard of. Really, however, you might be asking, what about egregious or severe violations and conditions, such things as, again, water, electricity, utilities, foundations, walls and ceilings collapsing and the like. The severity Depends, but I would argue that I would suggest that it is much, much more common than most people would be aware of. I'll give you an example. Let's say I go into an apartment for legal services. Let's say the Inspectional Services Division has gone in before I have. They might write up a report for maybe 5 or 10 violations. My reports might be 80 to 100 violations. Part of the reason is I have more time to do the inspections, but other reasons too. I'm not criticizing the inspectional services programs, but there's a difference in terms of capacity and resources to do these inspections. Who's responsible? Landlord's responsible. Who's responsible for enforcing? The city or the jurisdiction. Who's responsible for making sure it happens? The courts. Does that system always work? The answer is no. Unfortunately not, and I think part of our job is to advocate and repair those systems so that they work better. I don't believe they'll ever work perfectly, but I do believe that we can make it better and improve the conditions, improve the standards, improve the lives and the health of people living in those conditions. It's a never-ending battle. I think there are discussions we could have about how to improve it. I would refer you to Matt Desmond's book. Towards the end of his book, he has some suggestions and some recommendations. I think that would be an excellent discussion for your book group. And I'm happy to be part of those discussions in the future. But the system has many, many, many flaws. My goal, I know that was the last question. My goal has been tonight, first of all, to thank you for indulging me on this talk. But my goal is to, as you work on affordable housing, which I believe is critical, absolutely critical. But even those living in affordable housing need protections for maintaining conditions, making sure the landlord does what he or she should be responsible for, and also the protections, the legal protections, as well as the public health protections. I think that's also a critical piece to this very, very complex topic and situation that you and Bike and Build are working on every summer. And I'm very impressed with what you do. But I'm hopeful that this discussion helped broaden that awareness and looking at those other pieces that go into safe, as I call safe and habitable housing, as well as fair and decent, that Beth brought up with the introduction. I think it all goes together to provide better housing for everyone. And I think it's a right for everyone to have better housing and safe and habitable housing. Thank you.
Well, on that excellent call to action, I'm going to slip in one last question that a persistent questioner keeps asking. Do you think that tub is still there in the chat? It could be a one-word answer.
I have no idea. If the buildings are still there, the tubs might be. Oh, they might have rusted away at this point.
Well, Ethan, thank you so much for spending your time with us this evening and sharing your wealth of knowledge about housing and public health. Attendees, if you've enjoyed what you've learned this evening and feel inspired to donate to Bike and Build, please check out the link in the chat box, or you can learn more about us and our programs at our website at bikeandbuild.org or by following us on Facebook or Instagram. So thank you again, Ethan. We really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who attended. We hope to see you next week when we'll hear from Dewan Robinson from Natural Resource Defense Council about energy affordability and its relationship with housing. That's next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern.
Okay. Thank you again, and I wish everyone well.
All right. Stay safe, everybody.